Let's kick off this session. Welcome, everyone. So this is the session on commodities and peace. I'd like to welcome our illustrious speakers, panelists. I'm Daniel Litvin. I'm founder of Critical Resource, senior advisor to ERM and moderator of this session. And it's really fantastic to be at this important conference. So the topic, just to give a brief overview, commodities and peace, or natural resources and peace. It may be one among several sessions at the moment at this conference, but to my mind, there is a whole set of fascinating, huge and really complex questions underlying it, a lot to delve into. And just by way of my introductory thought, I think there are some very powerful historical echoes. Natural resources can be a foundation for peace, but for centuries, natural resources have been at the root of a whole host of conflicts and global tensions. Spin back 400 years, for example, to when the Spanish and the Portuguese empires conquered Latin America, South America, in part or largely in a quest for the gold of that region. Think about the late 19th century scramble for Africa among European powers, the brutal conquest of Africa, again motivated in part by the desire of European powers to gain control of Africa's natural resources. Or the 20th century, and indeed some of this century, the quest for control over oil supplies, particularly oil supplies in the Middle East, has been a factor in a number of wars and tensions and indeed coups and revolutions. And today, the war in Ukraine, of course, it's not just about natural resources, but natural resources is clearly an important theme. Consider the way in which Vladimir Putin sought to weaponize Russian gas supplies to Europe as part of that conflict. And now, of course, the world needs to embark on a huge shift in the natural resources it consumes. The energy transition and tackling climate change means that we need to drastically reduce fossil fuel use. But what does that mean for the economic and political stability of major oil and gas exporting nations? Will they transition effectively and smoothly, or will they become, or some of them, conflict-prone failed states? The energy transition also, of course, requires building a huge amount of new infrastructure, wind farms, solar farms, electric vehicle plants, batteries, and a very big extension of electricity grids. And that in turn is likely to require a lot more natural resource extraction, not fossil fuels, of course, but minerals like copper, like cobalt, like lithium, and like nickel, so-called critical minerals, all essential to a cleaner energy infrastructure. How to avoid that shift triggering new problems and conflict? Building new mines, for example, often inflames local social tensions. There are any number of proposed new critical mineral mines which are blocked because of local opposition. And of course there are geopolitical dangers, new geopolitical dangers here too. Many Western governments are worried about China's influence over the supply chains of many critical minerals. Might there potentially be wars in the 21st century over critical minerals in the same way that there were wars and conflicts in the 20th century partly over oil? Amid all this, what do governments, what do international financial institutions need to do to head off these looming problems? What indeed is the responsibility of the private sector, big natural resource companies, the big commodity trading houses, many of which are headquartered in Switzerland? What's their responsibility amid these shifts? In short, I think that there's lots of really interesting and important questions to try and answer in this session. We've got a little bit over an hour to come up with answers. I don't want to put any pressure on the panel at all to solve all of these problems, but let's see what we can do. And on that note, let me formally introduce the panel and our speakers for their, I think, really rich in expertise and experience. And in the order in which they will speak, first of all, Ambassador Ivo German, a senior figure at SECO, the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, where he's head of the Foreign Economic Affairs Directorate. And previously, Ivo headed the Macroeconomic Support Section in the Economic Cooperation and Development Division, and prior to that was head of Economic Trade and Financial Affairs at the Swiss Embassy in Washington. We have joining us kindly from the Philippines. I can see Cielo, but I'm not sure you can yet. You will see Cielo shortly. So Dr. Cielo Magno has served as Undersecretary of the Department of Finance of the Philippine government. She's also an Associate Professor in the University of the Philippines School of Economics and is currently also serves as Civil Society Representative in the Global Steering Committee of the Open Government Partnership. To my left, James Nicholson, who's head of social responsibility at Trafigura, the big commodity trading house. James joined Trafigura in 2010, and he's responsible for driving Trafigura's social performance agenda worldwide, including developing the company's leadership position on commodity trading, transparency, and responsible value chains. We have to James's left, Mark Robinson, Executive Director of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a very important multi-stakeholder initiative in this whole area. And Mark's been Executive Director of the EITI since 2018. He leads the organization's engagement on extractive transparency and managing the International Secretariat. And Mark Ummel, last but certainly not least, Mark is responsible for natural resources at SwissAid, the leading NGO, and for SwissAid, improving the management and governance of natural resources, particularly in the gold sector, is one of its areas of work. And Mark's been responsible for its work on commodities since 2018. So we've got a great panel and set of speakers. And perhaps to state the obvious, this is truly a multi-stakeholder panel in the sense we've got Ivo from government, we've got Cielo, formerly government, now leading academic civil society, James from the private sector, Mark, multi-stakeholder initiative, and the Mark over there, leading civil society. So, a very multi-stakeholder panel. I'll stop talking and hand over to Ivo. Sorry, I won't stop talking. One more thing to add, which is that in terms of the format of the session, so Ivo will give an opening presentation from the perspective of the Swiss government for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion. I'll pose some questions to the panelists for maybe 40 minutes or so. And then that will hopefully leave at least 20 minutes for questions from yourselves, and we're going to use, as has been the case in the other sessions, the Slido platform, and I don't know if it's possible to put the QR code, if possible, on screen, but if you can obviously download the QR code and put questions to the panel, and there'll be time at the end to deal with those. So please, I don't want to encourage people to use their mobile phones. You're not allowed to look at cat videos on YouTube, but please do use Slido to put questions to the audience. Thank you very much. Over to Ivo.
Thank you, Daniel. Distinguished guests, both in the audience and in the virtual realm, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, let's call it SECO, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. I'm thrilled to see such a diverse and esteemed group of participants and panelists gathered here today. And haven't we all been inspired this morning? From the brain to concrete action on the ground, with stories, with concepts. So I think if our brains are not activated now for an inspiring and thought-provoking discussion, I think where else could we do it? I'd like to welcome today's panel discussion on what is perhaps one of the most pressing and complex issues of our time, the energy transition. As we gather here today, we are faced with a critical question. Is this transition a blessing or a curse? On one hand, the demand for minerals critical for the energy transition is set to soar, presenting economic and social opportunities for resource-rich countries, many of them being developing or emerging economies. This could potentially lift millions out of poverty and pave the way for sustainable development. Yet, on the other hand, this increased demand, we all know it, raises the specter of distribution conflicts as competition for these resources intensifies. Moreover, as the transition progresses, fossil fuel-rich countries are likely to face significant challenges. The drop in demand for traditional energy sources could lead to stranded assets and economic upheaval, potentially fueling new conflicts. The stakes are high, and the consequences of mismanagement could be dire. But amidst these challenges lies, I mentioned it, also opportunities for international cooperation, for governments, international organizations, the private sector represented here today, as well as the civil society, to pave the way for a just and peaceful transition. Governments and international partners will have to work together to realize this opportunity. One of the main takeaways of this morning's session, we have to come together and we have to debate. Governance, transparency, and accountability are essential pillars upon which this transition must be built. Governance, transparency, and accountability. I would add one word, which was ownership this morning. I think ownership, again, is key and not easy to be built. Now, from the SECO's point of view, where we are active, effective macroeconomic management of extractive resources and carefully designed reforms and programs can help mitigate the risks and promote peace. Crucially, we must not overlook the role of the private sector in this equation. Daniel has mentioned it. Corporations have a responsibility to contribute to prosperity and prevent conflict. Responsible business conduct and good governance practices, such as ensuring that minerals from conflict regions are excluded from supply chains, as well as fighting corruption and illicit financial flows, are indispensable tools in promoting a just transition. And not least, a strong and active civil society is needed to strengthen bottom-up accountability and to raise awareness about issues that other stakeholders sometimes do not pay enough attention to. A just and peaceful transition is something we can only achieve together. Against this background, we're very glad that today's panel brings stakeholders with such a relevant and diverse background together. Now, why is this topic particularly pertinent for Switzerland? The high quality of human capital and infrastructure, easy access to financial and capital markets, an attractive tax structure, central time zone coverage, and a high quality of life. Doesn't that sound very Swiss? Yes. But this might be some of the reasons why Switzerland has become one of the world's leading hubs for commodity trading, which plays a crucial role in the flow of raw minerals. Commodity trading is an important pillar of the Swiss economy, with traders being amongst the largest multinational companies in terms of turnover and contributing significantly to some cantons' GDP and tax revenues. With this prominence comes great responsibility, both for the private sector and for the Swiss government. It is crucial to prioritize responsible sourcing of minerals and respect for human rights, alongside promoting transparency and accountability across the entire supply chain. For us at SECO, the extractive sector is not only a major economic factor domestically, but also a focus of our economic cooperation with partner developing countries. Most of these, such as Ghana, Indonesia, Peru, or South Africa, are resource-rich countries. Some face the challenge of fully utilizing the benefits of natural resources for their citizens. The increasing demand for critical minerals for the energy transition in the coming years may further accentuate this challenge. At SECO and in Switzerland, we're actively involved in initiatives aimed at tackling these challenges. For instance, Switzerland is a proud member of the EITI, of which we will hear more later on, which promotes transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. SECO has been supporting EITI since 2009, so we've been a long-standing donor there, and over the years we intensified our engagement financially and in terms of human resources. Our commitment reflects the EITI's success as a standard-setting initiative. For years, Switzerland has played an active role in promoting good governance in commodity trading. In addition to the EITI, SECO has an extensive bilateral and multilateral portfolio to support resource-rich countries in their efforts towards transparency and accountability. This includes tax and macroeconomic reforms, projects in responsible value chains, such as the Swiss Better Gold initiative, as well as transparency and governance projects in the commodities sector, such as our support to the Responsible Mining Index. Domestically, we have recently adopted a number of legislative changes regarding natural resources. So, we have some soft measures, but then sometimes we need regulation as well to go along with it. We introduced the obligation for companies engaged in extraction abroad to disclose their payments to governments, an obligation that can be extended to traders in the future. So enhanced transparency is key, also for the civil society to know what they're entitled to. Since 2022, large companies have an obligation to report on non-financial matters such as human rights, the environment, or corruption. Importers of so-called conflict minerals, for example, tantalum or gold, have to follow the OECD guidance for responsible mineral supply chains and hence demonstrate a due diligence process that prevents contributing to conflicts. This is especially important in the case of gold, since Switzerland hosts 4 of the world's largest gold refineries and is one of the world's largest gold importers. Also in 2022, Switzerland refined its custom statistics to distinguish mined gold from already refined gold. We are now pushing the World Customs Organization to also adopt this change. Switzerland also adheres to the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct. The framework was updated last year with substantial inputs from Switzerland. Currently, we are updating our national action plan for implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. These principles are the global standard for preventing and addressing the risk of adverse impacts on human rights involving business activity. Well, with its stable and political system and transparent regulatory environment, Switzerland offers unique opportunities to do business. It is our responsibility and that of the private sector active here in Switzerland to turn these benefits into opportunities also for resource-rich developing countries and their societies. But our efforts don't stop there. We recognize the importance of ongoing dialogue and international collaboration to navigate the complexities of the energy transition. This panel is just one step in this direction. So as we delve further into our discussion today, we should bear in mind the complexity and nuances of the energy transition. Let us explore together how we can harness its potential to create a better, more sustainable future for all. Only through dialogue and collaboration, I cannot underline it enough, can we navigate through this transition and create a world in which energy is not a source of conflict, but a force for progress and prosperity. And with that, I'm delighted to hand back to our distinguished moderator, Daniel, who will continue to shed light on these critical issues together with the panel of experts. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a very enriching discussion.
So thank you very much, Ivo, for that really great overview of both the issues and the very active approach that the Swiss government is taking on them. What I'll now do is pose an initial question, the same question to all of the panelists, and Cielo, starting with you, if you're happy with that. And I'm going to ask the panelists, it's a big question, but I'm going to ask them to be brief so that we can then dig more into some of the detail. The overall question is this. So as we've heard from Ivo, the energy transition means both likely soaring demand for critical minerals and declining demand, potentially rapidly declining demand, at least we hope, for fossil fuels. And so given all the risks of tension, of conflict, local, national and geopolitical, as a result of this massive process of change, what do our panelists think is needed? What are the key things needed to make the energy transition just and peaceful? Cielo, if you're happy to kick off.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe 3 points that I want to raise and put on the table on the aspect of conflict and the just transition. The first one is I think it's very important to include in the conversation the impact or how the extraction of this mineral, especially in developing countries and emerging economies, how the extraction will aggravate the impact of climate change. So for example, in the case of the Philippines, we're second highest exporter of nickel, but we're also the most vulnerable country with respect to climate change. The conversation of extracting these minerals and affecting all our communities and how that will aggravate the effect of climate change has not been discussed. So I think it's very important. The second aspect also is that, as you mentioned, historically, these countries have been the source of raw materials, right? And I think it's very important now to ensure that there will be a sustainable impact if we are to extract all these minerals that will support the just transition. But that part of that is recognizing that we have to ensure that there will be additional beneficiation in countries that will be exporting these raw minerals, because in the current state, as it is, we are still governed by the idea that this processing should be driven by efficiency. We extract raw materials from these poor countries, we process them somewhere else. I think it's high time now that we give these developing countries a chance to do value adding and beneficiation to further increase the benefits of extracting minerals in these countries. And then the third one, of course, from the lens of civil society and communities, I think it's also high time that we put the EITI global standard at the core of the just transition conversation. I think the role of communities have to be highlighted to ensure that they're part of the conversation in the decision on where to extract, how to extract, and how to utilize the return from this extraction. I will stop from there and then we'll further input later in the conversation. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Cielo. There was a lot to dig into there, so let's come back to some of those very good points. James, over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. And good morning, everyone. I think to be just and peaceful, we know that the transition can't leave anyone behind. We often hear that. We also know that it isn't going to be possible to have a just transition without the supply of these critical minerals that we've been discussing. Ultimately, it's weaknesses in the value chain, whether because of tension, geopolitical, etc., or metal shortages that will impact us all. So at Trafigura, what do we do? Because there's a lot of, often commodity traders have not explained what it is they do. But we, at Trafigura, we source, we store, we blend, and we deliver a vast range of commodities to customers worldwide. Now, to continue to do this efficiently, we need to respond very quickly and responsibly to shifts in supply and demand, to disruptions and challenging market dynamics. Last year, and I'm going to zoom in now into copper. Last year, we handled 21 million tons of non-ferrous and refined metals, and copper was a really big part of that. And that's a key transition metal. Why? Because as we look at the build-out of the grid worldwide, demand for copper is going to grow at an incredible rate. Actually, such an incredible rate that we see a huge supply and demand imbalance. By 2030, we believe there's going to be a supply gap of copper to the tune of about 4 million tons. Now, that's more than the world's 8 biggest copper mines produced in 2022. Now, that shortage will build tension, both locally and internationally. Local, national, geopolitical risks surely represent a massive challenge for all of us, but what I want to do is just for a moment shine a light on some of the very acute operational challenges that we're facing. One big hurdle relates to the 30, 40, 50 problem. Now, what do I mean by that? At the present day, the development, to develop a mine, a development plan for a mine is that typically we're looking at mines of about 30% smaller in size, 40% more expensive, taking 50% longer than it did a decade to build it. The challenge of logistics is another one, and a hurdle that is often overlooked. So take the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that has incredible potential to produce a lot more copper than it does at present and to really truly thrive in the transition environment. That potential counts for very little if you can't get that product to market. So at Trafigura, we're investing over $400 million as part of a consortium to reopen rail networks. Presently, that material is exported by truck. Those trucks can hit queues of about 50 kilometers long in getting out to ports. The simple act, well, very complex act, in fact, of investing in a rail network, for example, with US government support, will dramatically change the flows. Now, other challenges that I'm sure we're going to touch on include resource nationalism, technology shifts, so battery chemistry, uncoordinated and misaligned ESG demands from regulators, from customers and investors. Basically, too often, we're confronted by elaborate ESG standards dreamt up in very smart offices with little regard for the realities, the unintended consequences actually on the ground. Now, if improperly imposed, these standards could leave whole communities, in fact, whole nations, behind. And hopefully I'll give a little bit more color to that later. But again, for the transition to be just and peaceful, and for markets to thrive, we need expert supply chain managers, and that includes the likes of Trafigura. We need better transparency. We need better consumer understanding and a drive for sustainable, responsibly sourced metals. And lastly, we need global cooperation to agree and uphold achievable standards that support development, but don't compromise it. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Again, lots of really interesting points to get into. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and thank you to the federal government and to the Canton of Basel for inviting us to this important event. Our goal, our collective goal, and certainly the subject of this panel, is how to achieve a just, inclusive, and peaceful energy transition that primarily benefits a country's citizens. That has been our mission for the last 20 years at EITI, and now in the context of the energy transition, and of course critical mineral supply chains. I'm going to make two points about risk and then 2 points about mitigation of risk. Escalating demand for transition minerals undoubtedly increases the risks of conflict and instability. It's a very, very real risk that needs to be managed, and we're already seeing some evidence of the forms it's taking, at a stage where many mines have yet to be constructed under the terms that James just described to you. In particular, competition for resources intensifies the risk of conflict both within existing fragile and politically unstable countries, which are resource-rich, but also potentially between countries over natural resource endowments. But it's not all bleak. And as Cielo said earlier, community engagement is absolutely foundational to building long-term peace and mitigating conflict risk. And also, as Cielo drew attention to, value addition is fundamental to ensure that citizens do benefit in resource-rich countries. And we hear this as a very important priority from the implementing countries that are part of the EITI. What's in it for us, they ask. We're not just here to generate more minerals to fuel a green transition in the rich north. This time round, we want to see how we will gain from the transition. And in practice, that means, what does the transition deliver for jobs? How will it generate revenues to be invested in better schools and hospitals and roads? And how will that in turn generate better prospects for equity as a guarantee of a just and peaceful transition? So many countries in which natural resources are situated are already fragile. Roughly 1/3 of the countries, the 56 in which the EITI operates, have some aspect of fragility and conflict, and that is intensifying at the moment, in particular in parts of the Sahel, but also elsewhere in South Asia. And much of that has competition over resources at its roots. But we do know from lessons from the past, and we heard Ivo refer to the risk of a resource curse. We don't want to run another risk of a green resource curse with the energy transition. So there are important lessons. But commodity booms can potentially generate benefits if they are applied and distributed in the right ways. And we know there's a number of well-governed countries around the world that are resource-rich that have really doubled down and demonstrated long-term benefits for their citizens, including countries as diverse as Australia, Botswana, Chile, and Norway as some positive examples. But we know at the EITI that intensifying demand and competition for resources increases opportunities for corruption. We shouldn't be naive about this process. The sheer volume of resources being generated over the coming decades is itself an enormously attractive source of investment for corrupt actors to make a lot of money very fast through untransparent and opaque means. And of course, there are enormous problems of environmental damage and social grievances, which in turn can fuel political conflicts. And we've seen countries which are already afflicted by the bad governance of natural resources, ranging from the DRC to Venezuela and Zimbabwe. And we know that there are ways of better governing natural resources going forward. So I just want to highlight one very graphic example of a case that is just coming to light, which actually could generate very significant political instability, and that's the case of Venezuela, as it looks to its small neighbor to the east, Guyana, which of course is becoming potentially enormously rich for a very small country, but with very significant reservoirs of oil, which sees its prospects of moving to a middle-income state as something rich and imminent, notwithstanding governance and corruption risks. So one should not be under any illusion that a claim over half of Guyana's territory by an autocratic state, Venezuela, which is mismanaging its resources for its own people, is prompting by wanting a much bigger share of the very considerable resources lying off the shore of Guyana and neighboring Suriname. And that's just one example of the kind of intensification of conflict we may see elsewhere emerge. And I'll talk more about risk mitigation and prospects for improvement in the next round. Thank you.
Thanks very much. To my mind, among other things, a really good articulation of the huge problems ahead and the relevance of the sort of approach that EITI adopts to helping solve them. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to participate to this interesting panel. I think that the question you pose is already interesting, and it's a good point, because the question is not whether the energy transition is needed, but how to have a fair and a peaceful transition. And I think one important point is that producing countries have to benefit from this energy transition. And one important point here is that we need a tax reform at the global level. I think we have failed until now to have it. We have seen what the OECD has proposed. It was the 15%. It's too low, and it's interesting to see what happened at the UN General Assembly in New York with the proposition of the African country. To have this international tax cooperation framework. I think it's a very important point. Now, with the increased demand for critical minerals, I think it's not something new. We all know the challenges, but the challenges and the issue will become more and get bigger. So I think we should not repeat the same mistake that we have done in the past until now. And one important point also is that we need stronger regulation, not only in producing country, but also in importing country, in particular in Switzerland. And I hope we will have time to discuss about it later. We need legislation with strong requirements. And we should no more rely on the fact that the industry will self-regulate alone and have good practices, because we have seen until now that it's not working. We should also not stop relying on industry standards, because we have seen that those kind of industry schemes have been done by the industry for the industry and have not been able to prevent human rights violation, corruption, and environmental damage. So in our view, we will need strong regulation, in particular in terms of good governance, to fight against corruption. We need legislation which require a company to implement due diligence, in particular in terms of human rights and environment. I think that decent livelihood and health of communities and local population has to be at the heart, at the core really of this energy transition. We need accountability. I think it's a key point that companies have to be held accountable for the damage they are causing. And of course, we need transparency and traceability, and here the ITI, as Mark mentioned, is really playing a very important role here. And another important point is the engagement with artisanal and small-scale miners. I think that we have to engage in the formalization. We have today 45 million people which are working in those mines. They are already part of this energy transition. 200 million are benefited indirectly from this sector. So we cannot ignore it because this mineral is already coming in our supply chain and we have to engage with it. And then, as Cielo mentioned before, we need to have a local transformation. I think that producing countries have to move from having just fair share revenue to be key actor in the value chain. Instead of just being an exporter, they have to engage in processing, in adding values. So just in a nutshell, I think we need fairer tax regime, fairer value chain, and engagement in transparent, accountable, corruption-free governments and companies.
Great, thanks, Mark. Really well articulated case there. Let me take up some of the themes that you've already covered, and let's go in, perhaps in a little bit more depth. Cielo, perhaps I can turn to you, but this is a theme that's also come up among, I think, everyone else. The issue of value add, beneficiation, and particularly for resource-rich countries, developing countries in the global south. I'm sure everyone agrees that there needs to be more value add and more beneficiation. I suppose my question is, how can that be made to happen, given that there is, or historically, there's been always a bit of a race to the bottom, that those countries that have been most successful in attracting investment in the mining sector, say, and perhaps oil and gas as well, have been those that haven't put too tough demands on the international investors to build the processing plants and all that value chain, important though it is. So in short, how can we flip this historic race to the bottom to a race to the top?
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to make this a global conversation. There has to be some learning in the past. We know now that resource-seeking investors are not the same as efficiency-seeking investments, right? Efficiency-seeking investors are the ones sensitive to fiscal policies because they can go to specific countries because of all these offerings that countries are putting on the table. But if these are resource-seeking investors, they go to a country because the resources are there, right? So it gives a country more leverage in terms of the demand that they can ask from these companies. And I think this has to be a global conversation and understanding among resource-rich countries that a certain standard has to be put in place in terms of what we mean by fair taxation, just share in the extractive sectors. So this is not just about 15% corporate income tax rate. This is about what effective tax rate should be. And the reason why this has to be a global conversation is because sometimes, even at the national level, the miners and government officials are sometimes one and the same. And the goal is always to maximize profit. Not recognizing and taking into consideration all the negative externalities and whether the government will get a just share. Because if you're from a private sector, your goal is to maximize profit, minimize the tax that you're paying government, right? And if there are alignment in the interests of the private sector and the government, and if the civil society and communities are outside this conversation, then we'll definitely see conflict and we'll definitely see business as usual in terms of payment of taxes, payment of fair share, etc. So bringing this at the global level, agreeing among extractive countries what the standard should be with respect to effective tax rate, I think is very important and minimum in terms of making sure we get a fair share and we stop the race to the bottom.
That's great, Cielo. And you mentioned, just perhaps one other question, you mentioned earlier on in your comments Indonesia. I think you mentioned that in the context of some of the, the negative externalities, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with, say, nickel production in Indonesia. But Indonesia has been quite successful, at least from the perspective of some people, in that value adding, that beneficiation piece. Right. Are there lessons to learn from Indonesia as well, do you think?
Right. I think on a lot of a conservative economist perspective, they will be raising eyebrows with what Indonesia is doing, violating the free trade policies of imposing export taxes and the export of these unprocessed minerals, right? But we have seen in the experience of Indonesia, because they are a significant exporter of these minerals, they're able to use this as leverage to encourage downstream processing and now linking it to manufacturing. I think countries that are producers of this mineral, especially the unprocessed ones, should learn from the experience of Indonesia and take advantage of having this leverage to bargain some more and ensure that there will be processing and that manufacturing will happen in these countries, because otherwise we go back to what happened before. These countries will be sources of raw materials. Without additional beneficiation, we're not going to see development. It will result in conflict, damage to the environment, and suffering for communities. So I am glad that there's actually all these opportunities already to discuss at the global level, but I think we have to be fast in terms of acting and putting standards for countries to adapt.
Thanks, Cielo. And as you say, I think a lot of this is around the global conversation and setting a level playing field. James and others, you might want to come back on those points, but let me turn to another issue, if that's okay, related. And in a sense, it's the different perspective between Mark Umal and James on the issue of regulation I'm sure there's a lot of areas of agreement, but there's areas of disagreement. And by the way, I don't want to create conflict in a peace conference, but I think these are some important points to tease out. So as I heard it, James, you were saying that obviously regulation is important and needed, but there is a risk that some of the regulation coming down the track has unintended consequences. Mark, I think you were saying that in a sense, the problem is the weakness of regulation or the weakness of industry self-regulation. Yeah. Discuss.
Fight. Maybe we were touching on this last night over dinner, and I'm really delighted that you brought this out. I think actually there's a huge number of we're aligned in many respects. What I wanted to do last night, and perhaps I could do now, is just to throw a little bit of light onto one particular issue. As we discuss human rights, let's zero in to modern slavery. A couple of weeks ago, Trafigura produced its modern slavery report, its statement we've produced for many years, actually, on the basis that we are in scope of certain jurisdictions, including the UK, Australia, and Canada. Now, within one modern slavery report, we had to navigate a full range of definitions of disclosure requirements. And at the end, one asks oneself, actually, are we really zeroing in on the risks and doing what we can to affect change, or are we in danger of spending too much time reporting? In the current context, we're looking at the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive out of the EU. This is going to have a fundamental impact on certainly on my role, but we've got some interesting experiences of late as we consider due diligence. And when we take the German Supply Chain Act, what have the unintended consequences been? Well, on the positive side, the positive consequence is that companies like Trafigura are furnishing their receivers, those that we sell to in Germany, with far more information than ever before. So a ton of metal is just one thing, but a ton of information about environmental, social, governance impacts. Now, those receivers in some cases are turning around to say, okay, well, we've discussed your disclosures internally. We're concerned by the fact that you're operating in a high-risk jurisdiction. Reputationally, that doesn't look good for us. And for that reason, we no longer want to receive material from that particular developing nation. To my earlier comment, that's a massive problem because with this heightened situation of regulation, we're going to see developing countries, such as the DRC, that need to capitalize on this opportunity now, potentially being wiped out of the conversation because it's far easier to buy that cobalt from Australia, maybe even Morocco, and not the DRC. And that's a problem. That's an unintended consequence that we need to navigate and frankly work together on.
Thank you. Mark, please respond to that. Unintended consequences and your earlier point, industry regulation being insufficient.
Yeah, I think we should be very careful with this point because in our view, it's not because we should engage with this country and that means that we do not have to have a strong regulation where we have our seats. You mentioned the DRC. I think when you have law like the US Dodd-Frank Act, of course it's a risk because when you have like a list of countries where you cannot source, then there is a problem. And you have to source in the country and engage. But I think from our point of view, it's clear that we do not have bad and good country, but you have good and bad suppliers. So that's a very important point. And I think that we will encourage every company to engage in high risk and maybe even conflict affected area to source the material where it comes from. Because what we have seen now, in particular in the gold sector, is that the majority of the Swiss refiner, for example, they try to withdraw from the majority of the conflict-affected or high-risk area. But at the same time, this gold that they want to avoid is coming in the supply chain to other complex other supply chain, like, for example, from the UAE. And here I think that raises also the problem that we have more generally with the Swiss regulation, that before it was mentioned by Mr. Ivo German, some interesting point, but I think we should be clear on what happened with the Swiss regulation. I think we have some clear loophole, for example, on the Precious Metal Control Act. It's still not aligned on the OECD guidance. And I mean, this is very surprising because even the majority of the industry support that this legislation should be aligned on the OECD guidance. What does it mean? It means that today a refiner has to do his due diligence only until the first supplier and only on the legality of the gold. So which means that you can still import gold which have been extracted by children, or even conflict gold, which has been going, for example, extracted in north of Mali, exported from Bamako to Dubai, refined in Dubai, and imported in Switzerland. So I think that's a huge problem. And another is the transparency about where this gold is coming from. I mean, the huge problem that we have is that we still don't know exactly where a large part of the gold which enters the Swiss market, where it's come from. We have 150 tons of gold coming from the UAE every year without knowing where this gold is coming from. And this also raised the question about the coherence, I would say, about Switzerland, in the sense that on one side we have excellent projects implemented by the SDC, by SECO in several countries. And on the other one, we have like companies, in particular Trafigura, but also Glencore or other one, engaged with some country where they have doing resource-backed loans. And that's very, very risky. I have witnessed this when at the time I was at the SDC. On one side, you have Glencore who arrive, who give a loan to the country. 6 months later, you have the price of oil, which have just complete surge by half. And then the debt of the country have just increased by 2, and then they have a huge problem. And on one side, you have an excellent project on the SDC with education, and on the other, you have people who cannot, the whole system has been failed because people are not paying again because the government has to repay to Glencore about the debt. So here it raised the question about how can we engage with the private sector to be coherent and be careful with this. And same with Russia. I mean, we organize, we have heard this week that Switzerland is organizing a peace conference on Russia. That's an excellent news. On the other side, we know that gold from Russia has been exported mainly in 2022 to Dubai. And gold from Dubai, a majority of them is coming to Switzerland. So here is also a point where I think we should look for. And just the same, last point, sorry, I think we have seen what happened with the pressure that Switzerland has been under pressure from the financial sector in the past. And we have implemented in 2007, so in Switzerland, the FINMA, so a regulatory body for the financial sector. I think that the commodity sector in Switzerland, which represents 8% of GDP, so it's a very important sector. 50% of the gold is refined in Switzerland, 50% of cacao, 40% of 35% of oil is traded in Switzerland. So the sector is very big, and the risk of conflict financing, human rights violation is here. But we still do not have a supervisory body that we have in the financial market. So I think here it's also important that we have this in the commodity sector.
Thanks, Mark. Look, there's a lot of points in there that are worth... A lot of well-articulated points there. And James, you don't represent all commodity trading houses in Switzerland, but I would obviously want to come back to you on that. But shortly, if that's right, because I can see we're going to shortly turn to your Slido questions, and similar issues have been raised there. So, James, I will come back to you on that, if that's okay. Can I just ask you one question, Mark, just briefly back to you, also, Mark Umel. When I imagine for the Swiss government, there's, I would imagine, a degree of a balancing act here, that it wants to continue to attract commodity trading houses to Switzerland. How, from your perspective, should that balance be struck between, and that rightly or wrongly, the trading house will say, if there's too much regulation, we'll go elsewhere. How do you think that balance should be struck?
It's a good question, but I think that we have raised the point where we have to have a shift of the balance, because the negative impact of what happened with the commodity sector is higher than the risk of those companies leaving Switzerland. I think in particular, look at the company which have been involved in corruption cases, not only Trafigura in Brazil, but also Glencore, Vitol, Gunvor. I think at a certain time, we have to take our responsibility. And if we do not take our responsibility and do our homework, then the pressure will increase, and it will not be good, because at the end of the day, I think it's clear we have to implement it. Same with the Responsible Business Initiative. Well, it has not been accepted. We do not want to move forward. Okay, look at the EU, what happened? And the pressure will arrive. Same with the gold sector. We don't want to move forward. There are other countries which move. At the end, we will have to move. Then we have pressure from the UN, for Special Rapporteur who criticized Switzerland. This is not good for Switzerland, I think. Okay. So it's just a kind of responsibility, and also for the company. I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure that James will say, okay, if we have a strong regulation, we will leave. Because it's just, you have a strong regulation, you will act better. I think just in terms of due diligence, I mean, Trafigura, you source from more than 500 mines. I'm sure that if we will have a stronger law in Switzerland, you will have more staff involved in due diligence, and we will have more impact on the field. So thanks, I think that's an important point.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much. Let's just shift gear, and then we'll come back to some of the issues. James will get back to some of the issues with the Slido questions. Mark, you can pick up on any of that if you want to. The question I had for you, if you want to answer it, is around local conflict around mining projects, of which there's a huge amount. And I'm interested in what are, from your perspective, the ITI perspective, what are the main tools to reduce that, the extent to which community engagement, transparency initiatives are a partial solution to some of those problems?
Thanks very much, Danny. I guess I was wearing my multi-stakeholder hat as I was listening to this debate, because the EITI is about creating opportunities for public debate, not just on platforms like this, but public debate in producing countries, bringing together governments, companies, and civil society around the table to oversee the data and information that EITI generates through its reporting right across the value chain, including a very important provision on commodity trading transparency. And in that regard, Trafigura has been very forward-leaning amongst the commodity traders in encouraging more opening up and more light to be shed on the sector. So that's where the link is for us. A multi-stakeholder dialogue is a precious thing, and it's something we bring to the commodity sector at scale. Such an entity exists in all the 56 countries we operate in. In the Sahel, where we have seen a worrying succession of military coups in nearly every single country, the EITI is represented. It provides a real challenge to my board to know how best to respond. If we stay, we sometimes create the only platform for public debate and for the ability of civil society to exercise accountability demands on government and companies. The real challenge is some of the actors that benefit most from these situations are actually below the radar screen. They are often militia groups linked to established foreign powers, which are using military regimes as a cover for intense extraction under untransparent auspices. That needs light shed on it, and a multi-stakeholder group, a dialogue of the sort that we promote is one of the very, very few platforms, especially when the media is constrained, to be able to throw light on what is being produced where, how do these conditions affect the artisanal sector and the communities around them, what is being exported, where to, and for whose benefit. Coming very directly back to your point about community engagement, at virtually every mining global conference I go to, you hear community engagement is key. But the devil lies in the detail here. Most new mining will necessarily take place on land primarily owned by indigenous peoples or land-dependent peoples, and that demand is going to escalate. So it's not just a question of asking people are they comfortable with more mining, it's actually engaging communities from the very outset to say there is a demand for a product that lies in the soil under your lands. Are you comfortable with the idea of mining taking place? Here's possibilities for you to take part in this opportunity. There's jobs available for you and your people. There's going to be better services invested in. What are your demands and priorities as a result of this? Fundamentally important and so often neglected. Free, prior and informed consent amongst indigenous communities in particular, where mining could significantly increase. If those things don't take place, you're going to see a massive increase in conflict. You're going to see occupation of mines, as we have seen in a number of countries, notably in Ethiopia in recent years. And that's over quarrying. That's not even over critical minerals. And some governments responded by simply saying, we're not going to mine. Jamaica, for example. Much bauxite in Jamaica lies under lands owned by traditional communities, for want of a better term. The government, out of respect for those communities, has taken a really tough decision not to mine the highest value bauxite in that country in order to respect local community rights. So it's going to lead to some really tough trade-offs. What's so interesting in this whole discussion is that communities in Europe, when faced with a big expansion of mining, voice concerns very loudly. So in Serbia, last year, massive protests over a major Rio Tinto investment has actually put the brakes on a significant lithium mine. Similarly in Portugal, big protests over the expansion of lithium mining there. Not only led to the suspension of licenses, but also led to the resignation of the Prime Minister, who was closely associated with that. That's on our home turf in Europe. This is going to be magnified in communities across the world if that engagement is not a fundamental fact at the very outset to ensure this is a broad-based opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. Let's turn to your very interesting and good questions. And James, I'm going to turn to you initially, and what I'm going to try and do, in order to try and answer as many of the questions as we can, I would suggest we cluster the current first three on our list, and I don't know if it's possible to put it on the screen here, because all of them, in a way, relate to regulation of commodity trading houses. There's a particular question about corruption and the cases against Trafigura. Let me just read them out, but mind you can read them very well yourselves. But the first one still a huge political resistance against the establishment of a governmental commodity market supervision authority, as it already exists for financial institutions. Wouldn't this be an important step to more transparency? So, Mark, you raised that already, and I'm sure comes up a lot, James. Really interested in James, your views on that. Also, though, this point around, well, it's linked to what we've already discussed, and actually things are, the order's jumping around as we speak, but with the shift in the perception of Swiss neutrality, will the importance of Switzerland to commodity trading, of Switzerland for commodity traders decline and shift to UAE, for example? And then, James, there's a specific question around corruption as a source of conflict. What form of reparation does Trafigura plan to make in cases where the company was convicted of corruption? I know there may be legally there's a limit to what you can say, but interested in your response to that. James, you want to try and tackle some of that? And then, Cielo, I'd love to come to you on the question, at least it was up here, but it may have been debated around China. And oh yes, it's now second question, the role of China in resources. But James, first.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I laugh just because there's quite a lot to cover. So let me make a try, and I think for those I don't satisfy, I'd be delighted to take questions perhaps after the event. But just to say, I think there's a misconception that the commodity trading sector is not regulated, and in fact we are regulated. And I did shine a light on just one example, and that was modern slavery a little bit earlier. I think also there's perhaps a misunderstanding in so much as information and how we become competitive in future, and it really does hinge on this concept of diligence. As I said, it's not just about providing that massive volume of metal, material, whatever. It's actually in providing information fluidly and fluently on risks on the ground. And that certainly from Trafigura's perspective is where we believe that we can differentiate ourselves, and I believe strongly that we are differentiating ourselves. Mark touched on EITI and payments to governments and efforts that small steps that Trafigura have been a part of to try and increase transparency in the commodity trading sector. Back in 2013, I was part of a small team that released our first financial report. That might seem somewhat crazy to many in the room, but we're privately held. There was no immediate obligation to do that, but we put our financials in the public domain for the first time, as a public company would do. And many were surprised, because within that report, if you were to look back, you'd see detailed information on, for example, resource-backed loans, because we disclosed that information. Indeed, in latter years, 2015, we released our first sustainability report, again ahead of the curve, ahead of many others. But what I find somewhat regrettable is when you look back at the detail of the reports, there's a lot that's been misunderstood, or perhaps well, let's say Trafigura as a company can do so much more to communicate around its impacts and activities and engage in conversations, as can other traders, because whether it's releasing our payments to governments, as we have done since 2015, which by the way are considerable, what we're not finding is sufficient debate, or perhaps maybe we're not looking hard enough for opportunities to be tested on what those payments actually mean. Because when we explicitly released very clear, transparent data around our resource-backed loans that we're engaged with, what happened next? We were pushed for it for years. Silence. Now, is that because we did it and that took everyone by surprise, or more particularly, was it because stakeholders didn't feel able to navigate that data? And I think that's probably where we're at, where we need to work harder as Trafigura. Clearly, there are questions arising in relation to, for example, corruption and the recent agreement with the Department of Justice in the United States. So let me, to the extent I can, just touch on that. Trafigura is taking responsibility for the actions of former employees in Brazil 10 or more years ago. The matter itself does not reflect Trafigura's values or the conduct that we expect from any employee. And the Department of Justice actually has recognized the steps we have taken to invest in, for example, compliance functions in reaching the decision not, for example, to appoint an independent monitor over our activities. So with respect, I cannot share more information than that. I'm not legally obliged to do so. But again, Trafigura is taking responsibility for those actions of the past.
And James, you said that you're available to discuss with individual members on that afterwards. Cielo, this question of, and by the way, I think in everything, all of the panel members are saying there's so much more to dig into, but there's so little time. So let's move on to the next topic, which is this issue of China. The question specifically, I'm not sure, Cielo, whether you can see the specific question, but let me read it out to you. China seems to do better in accessing copper in Zambia and other commodities worldwide than Europe and other OECD countries. How much is that a threat for the guiding principles democratic countries are committed to follow? And Cielo, the reason I wanted to ask you about this, in large part, you know China well, you're geographically much closer to China, so you'll have had a lot of experience of, I imagine, Chinese investors and so on. Just your take on this topic would be great.
No, I agree that China has been very aggressive in terms of investing and capturing a majority share of the processed minerals in the country. While I was at the Department of Finance, I actually had a direct encounter with them, and they're willing to invest immediately, like on the next day, sign a memorandum of agreement between the countries to make sure that they invest and capture the unprocessed minerals, nickel, in the country. And I think this is where the conversation on the value of global standards come in and stricter regulation. Because, for example, assuming China really invested in a country like the Philippines, processing companies of China would still be catering to the same demands from Europe, from consumers, from manufacturing companies. So while maybe James is appreciating this stricter regulations, additional demand and unintended consequence, I think it's very important to have this comprehensive regulation that will be adopted not just by some countries, but also by manufacturing and even Chinese companies, so that they will be forced to comply and keep a certain level of standard for social and environmental concerns, or even with respect to corruption and engaging the state. Because even if it's the Chinese companies processing this, they will be supplying to the same companies as Samsung, as IBM, as Apple. So if a standard in terms of the supply chain will be established from where it's extracted down to the consumer level, it will be very helpful in shaping policies that govern this extractive sector. The reality is, Australia, European countries might have more mature institutions and laws, but there's an opportunity here to actually influence and try to diffuse some of these policies in countries where institutions are less mature. And this is the only way to make sure that countries that will be supplying these minerals will not be abused, and then will eventually be protected also and will benefit from the extraction of this raw material. So from my perspective, China or not, I think regulations, global standards are very important to be put in place, not just from the extraction, but down to the consumer level, monitoring, transparency, and accountability at every level of the supply chain.
And if I may, just a quick follow-up on that, Cielo, do you, because you quite rightly said that so far Chinese companies have been much more willing, or some of them have been more willing and quicker to build the beneficiation, the value add. The perception is that historically some of their social and environmental standards haven't been as tight. Is it possible to have both from China, both the speed and the appetite to invest in the value chain, and also much higher social and environmental standards, do you think?
Yeah, I think that will be highly dependent on the domestic policy of the country where China will be investing. Because, for example, in the case of the Philippines, when we were discussing with them, they're willing to adopt green technology in terms of the energy that they're going to use and the processing. They're very open in terms of all the policies that they're going to implement. When they showed us the facilities that they have been managing in other countries. So I think it's very important. That's why global conversation conversation is needed in terms of what are these policies that countries should be adopting. And I think I'm very lucky that the Philippines is a member of EITI. So we are aware of the certain standards. And that's why it is needed to be articulated so that governments will be aware and spaces created so that other stakeholders can be aware and can articulate these minimum demands to make sure that we benefit from the process.
Thanks, Hiro. Mark, the question that's currently top of this is almost written for you, I think. So let me turn to you. So let me read it out. For resource-rich countries, good extractive governance is key for sustainable development. How can the extractive industry become a supporter of a much-needed good governance rather than the cash-in rents bad governance offer to them?
Yeah, so I did want to talk about the wider private sector in relation to the extractive industries and their responsibilities, particularly in relation to the bigger question around conflict mitigation. And I'm going to give two examples of why this matters so much to many corporate members of the EITI, leading oil, gas and mining companies throughout the world. One is from Mozambique, where a little reported but big conflict in the northeast of the country coincided with Total's major investment in gas production, massive project. A jihadist group established a firm foothold in that area and disrupted operations for a good couple of years before a coalition of mainly African foreign forces dislodged their presence. The other example is from Australia, where Rio Tinto, as part of mining expansion, inadvertently bulldozed some Aboriginal sacred sites. Those are just two examples from two very different parts of the world, and which have conflict dimensions to them in very different ways, which is why this really fundamentally matters to companies. So how do and should they respond beyond purely the commodity trading sector? As I mentioned, many are members of the EITI. Why do they sign up, and what expectations are there on them to behave differently? They sign up because they believe and abide by a series of commitments to both tackle corruption risk, enhance transparency, and provide a fair share of the resource back to producing countries in the form of revenues. That's the compact. But we have recently published a series of assessments of how do companies measure up to the EITI standards. We call them expectations, and that includes commodity trading transparency, beneficial ownership, publication of contracts, commitment to an anti-corruption policy. And that was a really important piece of work, because for the first time we put that information in the public domain for all 65 odd companies. Most of those on our board performed very well. Some others very much had a mixed record on some of these. But this is not an exercise to bring out the big stick and therefore say you shouldn't be members. It's to say, look at the experience of the most forward-leaning companies, learn from that, take on better and stronger commitments, and that is happening as we speak. Right now, we're looking at progress in terms of company statements, company policies, publication of data, because here the race should be a race to the top. And that set of companies, in turn, need to work with their suppliers, they need to work with joint venture partners to instill the same values and commitments. Because of 65 companies, even if they're very significantly globally, there's many others which may be privately owned or state-owned enterprises where you have politically exposed persons with a very strong stake and interest. So our work does apply to that set of companies too. So in every single EITI country, all companies above a certain size report to the EITI, and that includes Chinese companies, includes Russian companies. So there is an accountability structure built in. And on the China question that you asked, too much of the current policy concern over critical mineral supply chains is driven by a fear of China. And it just so happens that China was very, very early in the game in terms of developing very considerable capacity for processing, for smelting, and for chip manufacturing, and the West is now trying to catch up. But China needs to be part of these conversations and not excluded as some competitor out there that should not be part and parcel of these broad global commitments. Because as I said, we have Chinese companies reporting under the EITI. And to end with a powerful example here, we just published a really important piece of work by the EITI in the DRC that reviewed a major Chinese mining contract entered into in the last, about 10 years ago. And of that original contract of 7 billion investment, 3 billion was meant to go into infrastructure, roads, hospitals. The study found that virtually none of that money had been spent. The study led the government in turn to renegotiate the original contract and doubled the amount that would be spent on those services and investments to 7 billion. That's a very powerful example of how transparency really matters in a country which under the EITI is committed to and publishes every single contract. So there's a good piece of news story to end with a country that is so often not a country that has good news coming out of it.
Thank you, Mark. We're running out of time, so with apologies that we're not going to be able to tackle all of your very good questions, I'm going to, in a minute or two, just give a quick, attempt to give a quick wrap-up. I wonder whether there's one final question. If any of you wants to give it's a huge and impossibly large question, but I suspect in many people's minds, and if any of you want to give like a 30-second attempt at it, it's where we go, it's gone right to the top. When will we start challenging the paradigm of endless economic growth? I think there's the notion that the extractive sector, I think for many people, sort of epitomizes this idea that we're just continually digging up stuff. And when's it going to end? And for all the economic benefits that brings, there's a lot of concern about that. Does anyone want to take, you don't have to, a 1 minute stab, just because we're running out of time, a 1 minute stab at that?
I think that the question is very challenging. From our point of view, it's clear we cannot unless have an economic growth, and at a certain point we need a degrowth, and we need to. We only have one planet, so at the end of the day, I think we all agree we need an energy transition, but we should also be very careful, and also what this implies for some country which are fully dependent on fossil fuels. I think it's clear that you have like country like Angola, South Sudan, which 90% of their revenue of their export is based on oil, for example. And for those countries, we have to help them, we have to support them, and that's a huge challenge. So I think that needs collaboration between states and engagement, and that also show how important it is to have the SDC, to have some program which have support to those countries. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, we should also be careful about the activity of the mining company, of the trading sector on those countries which are so dependent on that sector. And that's why I think that we understand when James, you say we have been more transparent, maybe we are doing something better than the other, and that's very well, and we recognize that you have tried to engage with ASM in Congo, that you have been the first to disclose some payment to government, and that's something very positive. But on the same side, I think that to have this trust, and when you say we do not work again with intermediaries in case of corruption and these kind of things, if you do this, to build trust, it's in your interest to have a strong regulation, to have a supervisory authority who supervise, and then everything is good, and then we can have trust. Because now just saying everything is good, impossible to trust you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm sorry to be, we're running out of time. Does anyone want to take 30 seconds on any of that? Mark?
I think the paradigm should be one of sustainable, inclusive development. If that indeed is the right framing, then it's worth remembering that as we all enjoy the fruits of the energy transition and the drive to renewables, the minerals required to drive that has to come from somewhere. So there will be a significant and continued demand for those minerals to fuel the energy transition for a green future. So the terms on which that's done are fundamental to the achievement of that goal.
Thanks, Mark. Cielo or James? Cielo.
Daniel, yeah. Maybe a quick add-on to what they mentioned is that I think we should start investing towards circular economy, and we can only do that if we make the extraction of raw minerals more expensive than recycling. You know, the value of life, the value of destruction, environment, social costs, they all have to be reflected in the cost of minerals. And if we will continuously be governed by efficiency efficiency, comparative advantage, and overburdening of regulation, then we continue to minimize the actual cost of extracting raw minerals. So the only way to change the system is to disrupt it and make extraction of raw minerals more expensive than recycling. And that's when we actually will see real investment in the reusing of what has been extracted already.
Would you like to, 30 seconds, James, limit or not?
Thank you to our hosts. I feel colleagues thank you to panelists on really fantastic interventions, and thank you to the audience. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, James. Look, time's almost up. We've covered a huge amount. Again, apologies for those of you who asked questions we didn't have time to cover. We haven't obviously solved all the problems in this area, but I think that with the insights of our very good panelists and speaker, we've generated some really important ideas. What stands out for me, very, very briefly, and there's lots, but among them, I think that the idea of more effective and arguably stronger regulation of mineral supply chains is key, really important, but to my mind, it's got to be done in a way that doesn't wash our hands of the underlying issues. We've got to engage with the issues rather than distance ourselves from them. I think Cielo's point, and the point's been echoed, the real importance of somehow engineering a shift from what historically has been a race to the bottom to a race to the top in terms of value add and other standards. The huge importance, to Mark's point and others' point, of multi-stakeholder dialogue. There's huge issues of trust and distrust here, which only by bringing parties together we're going to solve. And particularly, to my mind, at the global level, because of these worries about geopolitical conflict as a result of the supply-demand imbalance that James mentioned, and that could get nasty. So we need a lot more, I think, global dialogue involving China and the West and other countries as to how we're going to effectively share these resources. I could go on. It's been, to my mind, a fascinating conversation. I think we need to look at the lessons from history above all. Commodities can work for peace, but they can work, sadly, for conflict as well, if we're not careful. So I'd like to thank very much our panelists and speakers. I'd like to thank the Government of Switzerland for hosting this session in this conference, and thank you very much to you for engaging with the topic. So thank you, everyone.